It's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce Phyllis Schlafly, who's been a national leader of the conservative movement since the publication of her best-selling 1964 book, A Choice, Not an Echo. She wrote it during Barry Goldwater's run for the Republican presidential nomination in 1964, sold 3 million copies, and was credited in no small part with getting the nomination for Goldwater and also making her the most well-known woman in the Republican Party in America. Now think about it, ladies. This was 1964, 37 years ago, when many of you young women were not even a twinkle in your dad's eye yet. Mrs. Schlafly was shaping the history of our country back then, and she's been doing it for decades. She founded Eagle Forum in 1972. It's a nationwide organization of 80,000 conservative activists with chapters in every state. And I know that a number of the ladies here today are Eagle Forum members, and we're so happy to have you with us. I first came to know Mrs. Schlafly in 1973. When fresh out of college, I arrived in Washington and immediately became involved in the discussions about the Equal Rights Amendment. And it's no exaggeration to say that without Phyllis mobilizing millions of traditional women around America to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, it would have passed. It was on its way to easy ratification. She fought hard, she fought tough, she mobilized all these women who traditionally had not been active against all odds, and she won the battle for America, keeping so many terribly important legal decisions in the hands of our elected legislators instead of being decided by mostly unelected judges in the courts. She has an incredible resume, so full that I will just touch briefly on some of the highlights. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Washington University. She received her JD, her law degree, from Washington University Law School when she was in her 50s, and her kids were all grown. And she received her master's in political science from Harvard University. She's the author and the editor of 16 books on subjects as varied as family and feminism, nuclear strategy, education, and childcare. Her monthly newsletter, and we have some on the table outside, is called the Phyllis Schlafly Report. It's now in its 33rd year, and her syndicated column appears in 100 newspapers. But when you ask Mrs. Schlafly what is the most fulfilling thing she's ever done, she usually will say, teaching her 6 children to read before they entered school. She personally taught them all to read and didn't enter them in school until 2nd grade. She says she thinks that all a child gets from kindergarten is germs. And she said, our family got a bigger return for the time I spent on that activity than anything else I ever did. Phyllis was also into natural and organic foods years before it was cool and trendy. She drove to a farm once a week to get 12 gallons of unpasteurized milk and 12 dozen fertile eggs for her family. And breakfast in the Schlafly household meant hot-cooked Roman meal with wheat germ, honey, and cream. And peanut butter was always fresh, with fresh ground peanuts, never homogenized with other things to make it smooth. And based on her own success with her own children, she's written a phonics reading book called First Reader that's especially developed for teaching young children to read and write at home, so that other families, other moms and dads can experience the satisfaction that she had with her family. She was married in 1949 to Fred Schlafly, who many of you know also had been married 44 years when he passed away. And Fred and Phyllis raised 6 fine children. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Her oldest child, John, is a lawyer who works with Phyllis at Eagle Forum. Next is Bruce, a doctor. He has 7 children, aged 3 to 18, and all of them are homeschooled through the 6th grade. Next is Roger, a mathematician, a computer software engineer with 2 children, aged 1 and 3. Lisa is a lawyer who retired last year from her partnership in a major law firm to become a full-time mom, and she has 3 children, including twins. Andy is a lawyer. He has 2 children. They were homeschooled until 4th grade. And finally, Anne is a chef, caterer, and proprietor of the Kitchen Conservatory, a business that runs a cooking school and sells high-end culinary tools. And I asked Phyllis if she got to do the cooking for the family gatherings, and Phyllis said it was hard to get her to come and cook because she was so busy cooking in the business. And just a special thanks to Ellen Campbell for getting me all this inside information about Phyllis's family and children. I thought it might be fun for you all to hear it. Now, Phyllis can definitely be thought of as a competitive woman, but friends say that she is the most competitive, not about feminist issues or the UN or Clinton's treaties, but about who has the cutest grandchildren. And of course, she does. Now, we've given Mrs. Schlafly a rose here, just as Clare Boothe Luce often had a rose with her, and the rose, a symbol of beauty and charm, and in the Christian faith, represents hope and new life. All these words characterize Mrs. Schlafly and her decades of work with the help of God to make our country and our family stronger and better. She's a contemporary woman who has truly changed the course of history. And today, Mrs. Schlafly will speak on the legacy of Clinton's web of treaties. Please join me now in welcoming Mrs. Schlafly.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here today at the Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute. The last time I saw Clare Boothe Luce was at a President Reagan reception at the White House. She gave me a lift home in her limousine and was very, very generous and complimentary about my work and about the work of Eagle Forum. Last week, a tourist turned up at the gates of the White House, knocked, and said to the guard, I would like to see President Clinton. And the guard said, I'm sorry, President Clinton doesn't live here anymore. So he went away. And the next day, the tourist came back and said, I would like to see Bill Clinton. And the guard said, I told you yesterday, President Clinton doesn't live here anymore. So he went away. And the third day, he came back, and again, could I please see President Clinton? And the Marine Guard was a little nonplussed. He said, this is the third time I've told you Bill Clinton doesn't live here anymore. And the tourist said, I know that. I just love to hear you say it. Now, Bill Clinton is gone from the White House, but his legacy lives on. And his legacy is not just his contemptible treatment of women. His legacy is his web of treaties, the progeny of the UN conferences he participated in, his executive orders, and his international engagements. Clinton made no secret about what he was for. He went before the UN General Assembly in 1997, and he proclaimed the new global era and the emerging international system. He used a very apt metaphor. He said he was taking America into a web of institutions and arrangements to set the international ground rules for the 21st century. And that's exactly what he's been trying to do. He went on to say that the forces of global integration are a great tide, inexorably wearing away the established order of things. And he described our troops lost in a helicopter crash in Bosnia as citizens of the world. The following month, Bill Clinton went down to Argentina, one of his many trips, and he said, I'm trying to promote a reorganization of the world into a global system by merging integrated economies and integrated democracies. Now, the American people never signed off on integrating our economy with these corrupt, bankrupt regimes where people work for wages of 25 and 50 cents an hour. And the American people certainly don't want to integrate our U.S. republic with countries that are built on totalitarianism and terror without any constitutional rights. But Bill Clinton was very methodical. He surrounded himself with people who wanted to do exactly this. His chief foreign policy advisor was Strobe Talbott, his Rhodes Scholar and draft-dodging buddy, who wrote in Time magazine very clearly, national sovereignty isn't such a great idea. He said, nationhood as we know it will be obsolete. All states will recognize a single global authority. So that's what these people believed, and that's what they tried to bring about, not, of course, with one fell swoop, because the American people would never accept that, but one step at a time, through treaties, through the international conferences, through executive orders, and through the assignment of our armed services. The worst of all these treaties was the International Criminal Court, which Clinton signed on New Year's Eve. It is a terrible treaty. For the first time, it would give this foreign court the opportunity, the authority to try individuals, not just nations, as that world court does that we've had for decades. Of course, the crimes have not yet been defined, but we do know there would, of course, be no Bill of Rights. We would not have all the guarantees that we have under our Constitution. This treaty puts all U.S. servicemen and women at risk all over the world, and probably American travelers too, because although our treaty, this treaty was not ratified by the Senate and will not be ratified by our Senate, this impudent bunch of foreigners in The Hague is trying to assert the authority of the International Criminal Court over American personnel, even though we did not ratify the treaty. The only solution to this, I see, because of the mess that Clinton has gotten us into with his signing it, is the passage of Jesse Helms' American Service Members Protection Act, which would authorize the president to take any steps necessary to make sure that this court doesn't follow through with its attempt to grab jurisdiction over American citizens. Another one of these treaties, which is dear to the heart of both Bill and Hillary Clinton, is the United Nations Treaty on the Rights of the Child. This is a treaty signed by Clinton, again not ratified, which would set up a whole series of rights of the child to assert against his parent. For example, the treaty would give the child the right to rest and leisure. Now, what in the world does that mean? You say, Billy, clean up your room and carry out the garbage. And Billy says, oh, no, I have my UN right to rest and leisure. You say, Sally, turn off the TV and do your homework. And Sally says, oh, no, I have my UN right to get information from the media of my choice. You discipline your child for sassing you at the dinner table. And the child says, I have my UN right to express myself freely. Now, you understand this is not in conformance with American understanding of law at all. But all of these treaties, every one of them, sets up some kind of committee of so-called experts who are going to monitor the compliance with the treaty. And Article 43 of this treaty sets up a committee of 10 experts, and they've already looked into Great Britain's non-compliance and expressed grave disapproval with the fact that some British parents do spank their children. And in England, parents have the right to withdraw their children from sex education courses, and that really shouldn't be tolerated. Another one of these treaties, dear to the heart of Bill and Hillary Clinton, is the UN Treaty on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This would give us an international equal rights amendment enforced by some committee of foreign experts. And again, it sets up in Article 17 a committee of 23 experts to monitor compliance. Experts in feminism like Hillary Clinton, the late Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and so forth. And Article 1 covers political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other area. Article 2 covers customs and practices. Article 5 and 10 cover family education, revision of textbooks, and teaching methods. Now, at one point, Clinton held a gathering in the Rose Garden with all of his favorite feminists, and he announced that he is terribly embarrassed that we have not yet ratified this treaty. It is curious, the sort of thing that embarrassed President Clinton. But these, you know, they say old soldiers don't die, they just fade away. But I can tell you, old treaties don't die, they don't even fade away. They stay in the bottom drawer, and they can be called up at any time. So this is part of Clinton's web of treaties, part of his major legacy. Now, one of the principal ones of these treaties is the Global Warming Treaty, which is now called the Kyoto Protocol because it was Al Gore who went over to Kyoto, Japan to sign it and to sign on to it. We call it the Hot Air Treaty. And if it really comes out of these meanderings of writings like Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, if you want to see how really off the wall some of these things are. It is an attempt to regulate our economic life. It would bind the United States to reduce our energy emissions to 7% below our 1990 levels. So California, your current brownouts are nothing compared to what you would have to do if this treaty were ever ratified. Energy is the basis of our high standard of living. Such a reduction would cost 1 million jobs and massive disruptions in our economy. These drastic cutbacks would be enforced by big tax increases on gasoline, home fuel, and electricity. And meanwhile, under the terms of the treaty, China, India, Mexico, and 100 other developing nations would have no limitations at all. We can certainly thank President George W. Bush for saying he's not going to have anything more to do with the Kyoto Treaty. But these people haven't given up, and its legacy is still around. All of this is based on this junk science called global warming, whose predictions are no more reliable than the weatherman's guess of how much snow will fall in the next 20 years. Now, where I live, we had the coldest December in history, so I'm certainly glad we have some global warming. But let me tell you how this legacy persists. And we can see it in the new regulations on washing machines. Now, let me tell you, young women who don't remember back to the days before we had washing machines, that in my opinion, there is no single factor that did as much for the liberation of women as the invention of the washing machine. Now, Clinton issued regulations to save energy, to save water, to save electricity, to be put on the manufacture of washing machines. And when he issued this regulation, he based it on the fear of global warming. In order to prevent global warming, we have to have these new regulations to make washing machines more efficient. It is now admitted that at the low end of washing machines, the new ones will cost at least $240 more than current models. And at the high end, it'll be at least $500 more. I just bought a new washing machine for $450, and the dealer told me that if I bought one to comply with these standards, it would be $900. The Washington Post is talking about them as costing $1,000. Now, I think it is very disingenuous to tell lower middle-income people in this country that you're getting a tax cut of what? Maybe $100. And if your washing machine breaks down, it's going to cost you an additional $240. Unfortunately, the Bush administration has locked in the Clinton regulations on washing machines. And that is part of his legacy. Now, these California brownouts that you're hearing about, some people think that's a crisis, and it is a cause for alarm. I can tell you that the environmentalists and the global warming advocates are probably breaking out the champagne bottles. They think this is great. They want people to cut back on their use of electricity and use of energy. That is the goal of the Kyoto Protocol. They don't believe we should be using so much energy because we use more than the rest of the world. They want gas prices to go up. In fact, Al Gore went over and told the cartel in the Middle East to go ahead and raise gas prices. This enables some of these bankrupt countries to repay their loans to the New York banks. Now, I noticed that President Bush ordered the federal buildings in California to set their thermostats to 78 degrees. And I'm glad he's making that little effort to show that he feels the pain of the people in California. Maybe it won't hurt these federal employees. But in any event, I can tell you that in my home, it would be a significant reduction in my standard of living if I had to keep my house set at 78 degrees in the summer, and I don't think you would like that in Washington either. But the people who are pushing this type of treaty do not consider this a crisis. They consider it their goal. They want it. Another one of these treaties that Clinton worked on, which fortunately he didn't get very far with, was to revive the Law of the Sea Treaty, which Ronald Reagan killed when he was president. Again, the treaties don't die. They still kick around. This was a plan to force American businesses to sink billions of dollars in investment down to get the riches on the ocean floor and then turn them over to these third world countries to dole out as they see fit. The treaties to control the environment and take over the management of large areas of American land started with the Earth Summit in Rio in 1972. Fortunately, President Bush I refused to sign the Biodiversity Treaty. When Clinton became president, Al Gore persuaded him to sign it, and the Senate refused to ratify it, fortunately. However, Clinton's legacy lives on, and there's all sorts of progeny of this unratified treaty that continues to plague us. Clinton's executive order called the American Heritage Rivers Initiative enabled him to take over 10 rivers last year, putting hundreds of thousands of acres along the banks of rivers under the control of federal regulators with full authority. This is a direct attack on personal property rights. Another one of the progenies of this Earth Summit in Rio in 1972 is the Council on Sustainable Development. We have a law against the federal government writing curriculum for the public schools. They pay no attention to that. This council has put out all sorts of curricula to define environmental education in the public schools. And the bottom line of these curricula is to make kids feel guilty that the United States uses more energy per person than all the other countries of the world. And therefore, we should feel guilty about our successful prosperity and standard of living, and we should cut back and transfer our energy to other lands. These UN conferences cause all kinds of mischief. The one at Beijing that Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright went to on women has had all kinds of results in implementation through the executive branch, although there was never any legislation or treaty that came out of it. Another one of these conferences was the World Summit on Social Development in Copenhagen several years ago. And that's when these overpaid UN bureaucrats got together and thought up a nifty idea that is now being peddled as the Tobin tax. And this means that the UN would tax all international currency transactions and give the United Nations an independent source of revenue so they would not have to worry about whether the U.S. Congress passes the appropriations or not. Another one of these UN conferences was the UN Millennium Assembly that took place in New York last September. They thought up a whole list of mischievous ideas, the worst of which are they want to establish a United Nations Army, they want to establish an international registry of private gun ownership, and they want to minimize the influence of America in the United Nations by removing our veto and our permanent membership on the Security Council. Now, those things have not come about, but again, they're working for them on UN money, about 1/4 of which is paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. And I hope you noticed that yesterday, the United States was kicked off of the UN Human Rights Commission for the first time. Space was made for countries that really believe in human rights, like the Sudan and Pakistan and I think Uganda, or some of the countries that have slots on the Human Rights Commission, but the U.S. was kicked off. Another one of the treaties that Clinton got us locked into was the World Trade Organization, which was peddled as free trade, but which is not free trade at all. It is trade managed by a bunch of bureaucrats in Geneva. And the World Trade Organization is set up with a legislature of 135 countries, where we have the same vote as Haiti and Cuba. and they have the executive branch, all these bureaucrats, and then they have a kind of a judicial process where they are empowered to make all their decisions in secret and from which there is no appeal. This outfit has already ruled against the United States 4 times, and last year our Congress dutifully complied with the 4th ruling by adjusting our tax law to comply with what the World Trade Organization bureaucrats demanded. In this sorry tale of treaties, we had one victory. We did defeat the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which is very important for the defense of our country and a big shock to the Clintonites who didn't expect it. But another treaty that Clinton got through was the NATO Expansion Treaty, which commits us to defend the borders of the countries in Eastern Europe, borders that those people have been fighting about for thousands of years. Now, there isn't any direct legal connection between the NATO Expansion Treaty and our engagements in Bosnia and Yugoslavia, but there is a psychological link. Madeleine Albright was very clear when Clinton started his unconstitutional war in Yugoslavia that we had to relinquish some of our sovereignty to NATO, and that Yugoslavia, well, you could forget about Yugoslavia's sovereignty. That wasn't anything we needed to worry about anymore at all. Of course, NATO is used because the UN still is trying to recognize sovereign countries. So they had to go with NATO in order to do this end run around national sovereignty. And I think one of the results of this is that it is providing the mechanism for NATO to preempt the constitutional requirement that only Congress can declare war. It's obvious that there was never any exit plan for either Bosnia or Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, I find this recent discussion of Bob Kerrey rather ridiculous because the bombing of Yugoslavia was specifically designed for civilians. We know now that they hit almost just a handful of military targets. They mostly hit things like old folks' homes and children's playgrounds and knocking out the whole infrastructure, such as 35 bridges across the Danube River. But now we can see the end of this in what has happened in Kosovo, where NATO seems to be changing sides. You know, the whole thing was started in order to get the Serbs out of Kosovo. Well, we got the Serbs out of Kosovo, and now we find that the people we turned Kosovo over to are worse than the Serbs. And what are they going to do about the cutthroat, vicious Albanians who are now trying to move into Macedonia and take over even more parts of the world, which I think shows the futility of these foreign engagements when our country doesn't know what it's doing. The Ronald Reagan vision of military strategy was firmly grounded in the principle of peace through strength. That is, America should have more power than any other country so that the bad guys won't push us around. The Clinton policy was exactly the opposite. It was best expressed by Madeleine Albright, as quoted by Colin Powell in his autobiography. What's the point of having this superb military you're always talking about if we can't use it? So what they wanted to do was to use it for any purpose that they might think advantageous at the time. They might even have been wag the dog purposes. Now, there's one more area of this Clinton's legacy that needs to be addressed, and that is his executive orders. And his legacy does live on through these executive orders. His Presidential Decision Directive 25 placed or purported to give the president authority to place U.S. forces under the operational control of a foreign commander and under the United Nations rules of engagement. That has never been rescinded. It's still there. Another Clinton executive order was the effort to lock us into the ABM Treaty, the defunct, obsolete ABM Treaty. And fortunately, President George W. Bush just said this week that he's going to consider it out of date and no longer comply with it. So cheers for George W. Bush on that. Another one that we're still dealing with is Clinton's outrageous executive order last year, which purported to make not speaking English a new civil right. and to order all the federal agencies to provide federal benefits in languages other than English. 4 days before Janet Reno left office, she issued 15 pages of regulations in the Congressional Record to implement this treaty, this executive order. Now, his executive order and the regulations of the various departments, and all the others issued them too, were based on a lower court case called Alexander v. Sandoval. The Supreme Court, just 10 days ago, flatly reversed the lower court decision. This is one of the most significant opportunities for conservatives in years, and we should take advantage of it immediately. It has had almost no press. But I can tell you that as of yesterday, the press is reporting that the Department of Health and Human Services is trying to force doctors to hire translators in case any Medicaid or Medicare patient walks into his office who might not speak English. And this is how far it's gone. We should immediately move to make sure that our government speaks to us only in our national language, which is English. And we should get rid of all these busybody bureaucrats who are trying to force the schools to provide foreign languages in the schools, such as bilingual education, which is a complete fraud. And all of these regulations which were issued, some of them just before Bush took over and some just after. The English language is so important to the maintenance of support for our U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence. It is particularly important to conservatives because there are so many terms that are in common use with conservatives that cannot be accurately translated into other languages. Conservative, limited government, due process, separation of powers, states' rights, all these terms have no meaning to people in other languages and cannot be translated. And we will continue to lose wonderful congressmen like Jim Rogan and Bob Dornan if we continue to allow our government and our schools to promote and encourage people not to speak English. We should use this wonderful Supreme Court decision written just 10 days ago by Justice Scalia to get rid of the government providing any services whatsoever in any language other than English. So Clinton's legacy lives on. And all of these treaties and conferences and executive orders are a real threat to our way of life, to our energy consumption, to our standard of living, and to our Constitution itself. George Washington warned us in his farewell address, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." And it is time to heed his warning and also his great statement, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Schlafly. What a very informative speech. We have a little bit of time for questions and answers. Please identify yourself and speak up.
Hi, my name is Mary Ham, and I run a pregnancy center for Latinas, but I also serve on the board of the National Institute of Womanhood. And Phyllis, I've always been a great admirer of yours. When they read your biography, I didn't hear mention of the book that I recommend, which is her biography, Sweetheart of the Silent Majority. That was a great inspiration to me. My question is, with the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child, at NIW we've been discussing this UNICEF campaign called Say Yes to Children that's coming up in the fall. Have you heard anything about that, and can you give us some information?
No, I'm not really up on that. UNICEF does a lot of mischief, but I do not have the mischievous details to share with you now. Yes, yes.
Phyllis, thank you so much. I'm Linda Lecker, and I'm delighted to be in your presence. Would you be able to give us your honest reporting as to how significant do you think it's going to be with the people that Bush has surrounded himself with that are not really patriots to the core? And I'm concerned about the globalists that he's surrounded himself with.
Well, it's hard to make an evaluation. I think the president has made a lot of good appointments. Some I wasn't so enthusiastic about. I guess that's the way it goes. I am concerned about the next level and what I wish they were moving faster to get rid of these holdovers. When I went to John Ashcroft's swearing in, I heard him say that the Justice Department has I think it's 135,000 employees, and he is able to appoint only 200, which is just kind of a figure that shakes you as to what the problem is. And I wish they would move faster to get rid of the holdovers. I wish they would move faster to terminate a lot of the mischief that Clinton did in his last 6 months, which was really just so hurtful to our country. So we'll watch. We're hoping for the best. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Christine O'Donnell with the SALT. I know the UN is putting a lot of pressure on America to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child because we're one of only 2 countries, I believe it is, that haven't, and I think Somalia is the other one. Can you give any examples of other countries, developed countries, who have ratified this, how it's impacting their society?
How it's impacted. Well, I gave you the example of when the committee of experts went into England and made these impudent statements about how to raise their children, and that's really what they're after. They want to monitor the raising of our children. All of these treaties have fundamental problems when it comes to America. You're dealing with people who don't understand the whole American philosophy that rights come to individuals from our Creator, and it's the job of government to protect those rights. We don't get our rights from government. The UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child is based on the idea you get your rights from government or from the UN. And that's not our philosophy. But it's hard to deal with people who don't even understand it. The other thing they don't understand is our whole federal system. So they think if they sign a treaty, they just do it with the administration, and that overrides state laws in the whole area of family and education and everything else.
But are there any statistics like where child abuse has maybe gone up, or more families are being, the government comes in and takes families apart? Is information like that available? Because you have to imagine that in developed countries that have been practicing this, it can't help. Is any of that?
No, I don't have that kind of example. What they usually use is examples like in some countries where children are badly treated, which is certainly right. But you have to realize we live in a world where other countries sign treaties and pay no attention to them. And we have the extraordinary notion if you sign a contract, you're supposed to live up to it. And that is very different. And it does nothing for the poor waif who's picked up off the streets in Brazil and mistreated that we sign the treaty and give up some of our rights. Now you need to know that both the UN Treaty on the Rights of the Child and the one on women are special lobbying projects of one of these 501c3 tax-deductible outfits, which is a special pet of Hillary Clinton, namely the Children's Defense Fund. And it has such extraordinary leverage in the media. People in the media will go to their fundraisers, and it's headed by Hillary's good friend Marian Wright Edelman, and they lobby specifically on these 2 treaties. And so, as I say, they don't die, they're still there. And they are all bad news. I mean, I can't think of a good treaty that's been around in a long time. Every one of them diminishes our sovereignty in some way. Yes? Sheila?
Sheila Maloney. Question for you. The Equal Rights Amendment is obviously something that you're probably most known for, but most of us weren't around when that was being fought. And I know there's some feminists in Congress who have introduced a bill to, again, do the Equal Rights Amendment. And maybe you could give just a few brief statements as to why people from my generation should still be against the Equal Rights Amendment, and why were you against the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, okay, that's... really calls for another speech, but giving you a quick executive summary. The Equal Rights Amendment was debated for 10 years, and it was defeated. I will say it came out in '72. A big issue then was drafting women. Now, I tell all the college students, you were fortunate to live in the post-Reagan era when we have a volunteer military. But believe me, the draft was a real thing in the '70s. And it was pretty hard to convince young women that we're going to give you a new constitutional amendment, and the first thing that will happen is you have to go sign up for the military draft like your brothers. I mean, that's the way it couldn't be sold to my daughters. They thought that was crazy. And there were other reasons, including the grab for power at the federal level, the assault on the rights of wives, and so forth. It was defeated. Every year since it died on June 30th, 1982, in every session it has been reintroduced in Congress, and it's gone nowhere. It's gone nowhere, and it isn't going anywhere, because it is now clear that the reason there are two reasons why they want it: tax-funded abortions and same-sex marriages. And it is absolutely crystal clear that this is what they hope to get out of it and why they push it. And the reason we know this is because of the state court decisions and the way their people have litigated and the decision in a number of states, but specifically the New Mexico State Supreme Court. New Mexico and Hawaii are two of the only few states that put in their state constitution the same language as the federal. And the feminist judge, who is a majority of the New Mexico Supreme Court, held, and there's their theory, because abortion is something that happens only to women. If you deny any benefit on the basis to women, you have discriminated on account of sex within the meaning of ERA. So New Mexico, as a result, is now required to pay for Medicaid abortions. And it's because of the state ERA. A similar thing happened in Hawaii, where the homosexuals made their big effort. And they got the Hawaii Supreme Court to hold, see, the language of ERA is equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Now, if you deny a marriage license to a man and a man, you have obviously discriminated on account of sex. And that's what the Hawaii Supreme Court held. Hawaii then had to go through the agony of passing another constitutional amendment saying, in effect, we didn't mean that when we passed ERA, so we have to undo that. So it is crystal clear that that is what they're for and why they are for it. And even the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court does not say that taxpayer funding of abortion is a constitutional right. They knocked that down in Harris v. McRae. And so the American people are not willing to accept either one of those propositions. There are enormous majorities against both of them, and that is why we have to keep knocking down ERA, even though some of these tired-out old feminists are still trying to talk about it. I will tell you, I went to a hearing in Missouri a few months ago. And after the advocate made her spiel, one of the senators said, well, now, can you tell me any way that women are discriminated against today that ERA would remedy? Well, the first example was women are exempt from military draft registration. Big discrimination, okay? The second was under Title VII, there's one old case, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, that said that you do not have to hire a woman to serve as a guard in an Alabama maximum security prison. And those were the two examples of current discrimination that they were able to come up with. And for this, we need to change the Constitution? It makes no sense. Okay. Wait, who have we heard from? Okay, we'll go back to you then.
Do you see a link between the fight for same-sex marriage and population control?
Yes, probably. Probably, yes.
I have a
Yes.
question about the UN.
Yeah.
For years, there's been a discussion about taking the UN headquarters out of the United States, as well as taking the U.S. out of the UN. When I read the article about the U.S. being thrown off the UN's Human Rights Council, I thought, aha, you think this discussion will begin again?
Well, that would be a good idea. But I think the UN really showed how futile it is when China held our crew over there for 11 days. Nobody even said, let the UN solve this problem. It's kind of hopeless. I want to point out that for those of you who are really interested in this subject, I have two things available from Eagle Forum. One is a very wonderful one-hour video called Global Governance, which discusses these treaties, UN conferences, and so forth. It's done like a TV documentary. It has interviews with Jesse Helms, John Ashcroft, Pat Buchanan, Mike Ferris, Michael New, Gene Kirkpatrick, a lot of good people you know, and it's very interesting and gives great backup. I also have a new briefing book called Allegiance, available from Eagle Forum, which has one page on each one of these treaties with bullet points and how to remedy it, and then a section on the UN conferences, a section on the foreign engagements and national security, and a section on the executive orders.